Evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this evening. I know it's late. Just can someone put their thumbs up? You can hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you, Betty. Thank you all for joining me, and thanks to everybody who encouraged me. And kol hakavod to Ruthie Browdy, who gave the speech on nutrition, and to Susie, who did it last week. And I hope that will encourage other people to stand up and volunteer themselves in whatever way they can, either to give classes or to do something like cookery demonstrations or something like that. A big shloach to the Rov, who's been giving shurim every night, and the Rebbitzin, who he couldn't do it without her support. And of course, Dovi, Siegel, and the board, and all the people who work tirelessly behind the scenes. The building in Brent Street might be shut, but the shul and the community is very much open. There's a handout that accompanies the class. I'm going to screen share in a minute so people can follow, so you don't have to follow, you don't have to have that paper, so don't worry if you don't have that paper. And I've put everybody on mute, but if you've all got the power, I believe, to unmute yourself if you want to interrupt me. I don't mind if you want to add something or if you want to ask something, that's no problem. I'd like to dedicate this year for Refuah Shalema for Eli Zeliger, Rafal Elchanan Shimon Ben Bela, who is still, unfortunately, still very unwell, and all the cholim who are suffering at this very difficult time. I know Susie gave a class last week about the Megillah, so for those people who heard a lot about it, it's not going to be, obviously it's about the Megillah, but it's not going to be something, not going to be at all similar. First of all, I'd just like to speak about the reasons why we read Megillas Rus on Shavuos. First of all, David, who we talk about his genealogy, he was born and died on Shavuos. Ruth was a Moabite, and because of that, Shmuel HaNovi wrote the Book of Ruth to legitimize David's birth. Because we'll learn a little bit later that in Devarim we learn that a person who converts from the country of Moab, they are not allowed to marry into the Jewish nation. So that's why we talk about it. And at the end of the Book of Ruth, we talk about the genealogy of David. It's also linked very much to the harvest time. And we know that's the time of the year that Shavuos falls, but also at the time of the year that the story of the harvest is in the Book of Ruth. Also, Ruth became Jewish. She is the ultimate, so to speak, ger. We learn all our laws of gerus from here. And we are going to arrive at Matan Torah on Shavuos, which is next week. And we, like a ger who starts off really enthusiastic and committed to Hashem, we are, as members of Klal Yisrael, renewing our own commitment to Hashem at this time of the year. A very quick story. I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but the Book of Ruth, opens with a terrible famine ravished the land of Israel. Elimelech was a very rich man. He was one of the leaders of the community. He neglected perhaps his community responsibility, and he took his wife Naomi and their two sons, and they settled in Moab. There, Machlon, one of his sons, married a Moabite princess, and the other son married Orpah. Naomi was left a poor widow. First her husband died, then her sons died, and she was left with Ruth and Orpah. And she said to them, I'm going back to the land of Israel. And they said, I want to come with you. And she's like, no, don't waste your life, just stay here. And eventually Orpah goes back, but Ruth clings to Naomi, and she goes with Naomi to the land of Israel. They have got absolutely no money, and Ruth has to go gleaning in the fields to get some just basic food in order to survive. There, Naomi says to her, go and collect in the field of Boaz and go and speak to Boaz. Maybe he's a kinsman and maybe he can marry you. And then eventually Boaz and Ruth get married. The following day, it's actually the day later after the story when they meet in the threshing floor. The following day, Ruth is pregnant, Boaz dies, and Ruth has a son whose name is Oved. Oved is the father of Yishai. Yishai is the father of David HaMelech. So here we go. I'm going to try and do the screen sharing. Let me see. If you don't like screen sharing, and you can sort of get rid of the screen share, or you can make me bigger, or you can make the screen bigger, whatever you like, everything, you can do whatever you want to make it bigger. Just 1 second. Make myself bigger. There is a chat facility. If people want to write in the chat, I can't promise that I can look at everything all at the same time, but I will do my very best. Okay. So the Book of Ruth opens. Pasuk 1, Perek 1, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph. Source 1 on your sheet if you've got it. Vayelech ish mi beis lechem Yehuda. Lagor b'stei Moav, hu v'ishto b'shnei bonov. And does someone want me? Or someone unmuted himself? Okay. A man from Beis Lechem Yehuda and went with his wife and 2 sons to reside in the fields of Moab. There's a lecturer of Jewish philosophy in Bar Ilan University. His name is Raphael Shuchat. I hope I'm mentioning his name correctly. He says, perhaps this is the most ironic posuk in the whole of Megillas Rus. We start off in a book which is telling us about people, and we're going to learn lots and lots, and that's why I'm going to talk about names. It starts off with a nameless man, Vayelech Ish, without saying anything about his name. We know he's from the tribe of Yehuda, and he goes with his wife, who is unnamed, and his 2 sons that are unnamed. Look carefully at where he comes from. He leaves Beis Lechem. Beis Lechem, we say Bethlehem, but in fact, the word Beis Lechem, Beis, like bias, is a house. He leaves, the country of Israel is under famine, but he leaves what is called Beis Lechem, the house of bread. He leaves the house and security of the house of bread. Lagor b'stei Moav. A field is much less safe and secure than a house. And Moab, it's like known, Moab is like the arch enemy of Bnei Israel. They were unkind to us. When we came out of the desert, they didn't greet us with bread and water. It's known that they were inhospitable. Look at the irony in the first pasuk. An unnamed man from the house of bread goes to live in the field, which is not safe, of Moab, the place which is inhospitable and ungenerous, didn't give us bread and food, him, his wife, and his 2 sons. So I'd like to suggest, following the idea of what this man, Raphael Shuchat, suggests, is that the names in the Book of Ruth are used as literary devices. They are like to teach us something much more important than the actual names of the people. The word shame comes up in the book 11 times. There's only 85 psukim in the whole book. And the word which is very related to shame is shom, another 5 times. That is Posuk Aleph. Remember, Posuk Aleph gives us no identity. There is a concept, an English concept called nominative determinism. It's a hypothesis that people tend to gravitate towards areas of work that fit their names. For example, and these are not my examples, somebody else showed me where to find this, there's a man whose name is Mr. Constable, and he is a policeman. Or Miss Painter is an artist. Very ironic, but very funny. Some people have their names are acronyms. Don't ask me how I found out all these words, very interesting. Where their name is regarded somewhat amusingly appropriate to their occupation. My best example is a Chinese lawyer whose name is Su Yu, which is quite funny. Obviously, her surname is YU, but it's like a joke that her name is Su Yu. Mankind have long had the convention to name people for certain reasons. The ancient Romans used the phrase, its Latin phrase, nomen est omen, which means your name is your destiny, or your name is a sign. There are thoughts that Roman armies would put soldiers at the front of the battlefield whose names were something like Victor. Whose names were something like Victor because they hoped, in that hope, that person would be victorious. The Gemara, which is source 2 on your sheet, the Gemara asks the question, they ask the question, where do we know that a person's name affects one's life? So it says in Gemara Brachos, Zion, Shama Gorein, a person's name is a cause or future occurrences. Something might happen because of how you're named, who you're named from, etc., etc. And even further, the Gemara in Yuma in Pei Gimel, Rabbi Meir Hayodayik B'Shmei. He was careful and he interpreted names. He looked at the names of people and he thought to himself, what can I learn from this? For example, there was a man, he went to an inn one day and there was a man whose name was Kedar, and he was like, not staying in that inn because there's no way, because Kedar is like, there's a pasuk in the Tanakh which says Kedar and it says the word destroy in it. So he says, I'm definitely not staying there. So that's really interesting. What I'd like to do today is look at the names of the Gemara, look at the names in the book of Ruth, and see what Chazal tell us about each and every name. So remembering, of course, the book of Ruth opens up with no names. Here comes Posuk Beis, okay? Posuk Beis is source 4 on your sheet. V'shem haish Elimelech. The name of the man was Elimelech. Look how many times the word Shem comes just in the second posuk. V'shem ishto Naomi, and the name of his wife was Naomi. V'shem shnei vanov, and the name of his two sons, Machlon and Chilion. The name of the two sons were Machlon and Chilion. Later on, we see the importance of names because Naomi herself, when she leaves Moab, she says to the people, this is source 5 in Posuk Kaf and Perek Aleph, Vatoma alehem, al tikrena li Naomi, don't call me Naomi, korena li Mara, call me bitter. Mar bitter. She says, call me bitter. So let's look at the names in Posuk Aleph. Let's start with source 6. V'shem ha'ish Elimelech. The name of the man was Elimelech. The Medrash in Rus Chava, Perek Beis Hay, tells us, Shehaya Omer, that he used to say, Eli Tovo Malchus. If you look at the words Elimelech, Eli Tovo Malchus, Melech Malchus, he thought to himself, kingship is coming my way. Yes, he was from the tribe of Yehudah, but he was a bit like, he was a leader, but perhaps he didn't take his leadership responsibilities seriously. He knew he could have been a king and a leader of Am Yisrael, but he walked away from it. He thought to himself, and maybe he was smug in saying, kingship's coming my way. V'shem ishto Naomi, and his wife's name was Naomi. Shehayu ma'aseha na'im u'na'imim. The word Naomi is a beautiful name. It means pleasant, nice, because her deeds were pleasant and pleasing. It's a play on the words Naomi, Na'im, Na'imim. V'shem shnei banav, Machlon v'Chilion, and the names of his two sons were Machlon and Chilion. And this is where it really gets interesting, because like you might have heard people called Elimelech, you might have heard people called Naomi, but it's very unusual for someone to be called Machlon and Chilion. And the reason is because of what the words Machlon and Chilion mean. And Rus Chava says, Machlon, Shenimchu, you can see the mem and the ches, Nimchu min ha'olam, because he was erased, like mechika. Min ha'olam. V'chilion, shekolu min ha'olam, the same letters, kaf lamed, he was destroyed from the world. Furthermore, the Gemara Baba Basra, source 7 in your sheet, let's move it up for you, says, Lama nikra shamam Machlon v'Chilion. Why are their names Machlon and Chilion? She'osu gufon chulin. The word chulin sounds like Machlon again, the ches lamed, because they profaned their bodies. They made their bodies, instead of being kadosh, holy, marrying part of Klal Yisrael, they married non-Jewish Moabites. V'Chilion, shenischayvu kliya lamakom. Their punishment was to receive destruction from Hashem. There are other ideas about what their names are. So, for example, the word machala is also related to machlon, like an illness, or macha, to erase, what we said before. Ultimately, machlon was forgiven, and we have the word like mechila, we have forgiveness. Hashem ultimately forgave Machlon for what he did, and his name was rebuilt through his widow Ruth. A very strange name to call your children. Destruction, decimation, awful, awful names. But we know that in Divrei Hayomim, which is source 8 on your sheet, in Divrei Hayomim Aleph, Perek Dalet, Posuk Kaf Beis, we have this sentence where we're talking about Yehuda's family, and it says, V'yoash v'soraf asher ba'alu leMoab. And two people whose names were Yoash and Soraf, who are from the tribe of Yehudah, married into Moab. Interesting. Rashi tells us there that Yoash and Soraf were in fact Machlon and Chilion's real names. So they're called Machlon and Chilion to tell you, it's like dramatizing their names. It's like almost calling them a nickname to say what they did and why they were decimated and why they were destroyed and why they had to leave. They completely got destroyed from the world. And the Baba Basra 91 tells us that the word Yoash can be from the word Shenis Yashu, because they despaired of the redemption of the Geula, and Saraf, like from the word Sreifa, because Shenis Chayvu Sreifa Lamakom, even though these were their names, they were liable, they should have been punished with burning because of their sins against Hashem. Catastrophic, really terrible. Like their names already from where they started were terrible, absolutely terrible. Why Elimelech and Naomi would have called their children that, we don't know. They did call their children that, and I'm sure there are nice interpretations. The Chazal are pointing the finger very strongly at Machlon and Chilion and saying they were bad boys, they did the wrong thing. Machlon and Chilion married Moabite women. And that's source 9 in your sheet. Look how the Moabite women are introduced to us in Perek Aleph Pasuk Daled. Vayisu lahem noshim Moavios, and they married, they took by marriage women, Moabite women. Shem ha'achas Orpah, the name of the first one is Orpah, V'shem ha'shen is Ruth, and the name of the second one is Ruth. Again, we see their name. We see this the whole time. Let's look at source 10, Ruth Rabbah. Shem ha'achas Orpah. What does the word Orpah, where does that come from? What does it mean? Shehafcha oref lachamoso. That she turned her back, literally her neck, like kishinu oref, that she turned her back on her mother-in-law. That's why her name was Orpah. The Shem Hashenis Rus. And Ruth's name, the second one's name was Ruth, Shera'asa b'divrei chamosa. Because from like the letters from Rus, Ra'asa, she considered the words of her mother-in-law. Just moving it up for you, for the people who don't have the sheet. The Gemara in Baba Basra gives us another reason why her name was Rus. Source 11. Lama nikra shema Rus. Why was her name Rus? Sheyotza mimena David. That from her great-grandson was David. Sherivahu lahakodesh baruch hu b'shiros v'sish bachos. The word rivahu it looks like the resh and the vav from the word Ruth. That from her David descended, and he satiated, or he inundated, or he overflowed Hashem with Tehillim, the songs of praises. For example, we say the word kosi revaya. It's etymologically similar to the word riva, inundated, in the letters of the word Rus, resh, vav. There are other ideas in Chazal as to what Rus's name could be. She could be like Reus, like friendship, because she stood by her mother-in-law and had the ultimate friendship. Maybe the letters of her name, if you change them around, instead of being Rus, Resh Vav Sof, it could be Sof Vav Resh, like a Torah, which is a turtle dove, which was permitted and kosher to go on the altar, the same way Rus was permitted and kosher to be part of Klal Yisrael. Originally, her name was Gillis, according to the Midrash. That's what they say. We can also say the gematria of Rus is 606, plus the 7 Noachite laws. She agreed to be part of Bnei Israel and keep the 613 mitzvahs. I'll just pause there if anyone's got any questions or comments. Okay, lovely. So we are moving on to something else, and that is the idea of source 12. When Ruth comes with Naomi, they try to engage with Boaz, and she comes to Boaz in the night, and Naomi tells Ruth, go up to Boaz in the middle of the night and lie next to him on the floor and tell him that he is a possible redeemer for you. Boaz doesn't do anything that night because he believes that there is a closer redeemer. There is someone who can marry Ruth who is closer. Now, it's a bit complicated. I know Susie spoke about it last week, but basically, if a man dies and his wife is left childless, his widow is left childless, there is a mitzvah upon the brother of the deceased to marry his brother's widow and have children with her, or a child, at least a child, to bring up the name of the person who died. And that mitzvah is called Yibum. We're assuming that in the ancient times, not only did this apply to brothers, but it also applied to close family relatives. And for that, I brought a little, it's a little diagram that I put at the bottom of the sheet to show you what I'm talking about. So here's where Boaz ultimately marries Ruth, and they have a son called Oved, Yishai, and Yishai has David. Ruth was previously married to Machlon. Boaz marries Ruth. Now, Boaz's father is called Salma or Salmon. He's called both those two names, the last perek of Ruth. And he definitely had a brother called Elimelech, and that's the man who died, who was originally married to Naomi, the father of Machlon and Chilion. But either Boaz was their brother and not Salmon. It's debatable. I'm going to say he was the nephew, even though he says we are brothers, but the Gemara tells us it's because you can call your uncle your brothers. And there was a third brother, and his name was Ploni Almoni. Now, in ancient times, when there were land parcels, if a person died, the idea was to allow the brothers who lived in the same area, or the cousins, or the people who lived nearby, like the whole of the land of Israel was split up into tribes. And in order to not lose tribal holdings, the tribes were encouraged to stay in their tribe. So if someone died, then their brothers would have the first, in inverted commas, first refusal to buy the land. But with the land comes the widow. So that's why this person, whose name we'll discuss in a minute, he's called in Megillas Rus Ploni Almoni, is not willing to get involved. Even though he's happy to have the land, he doesn't want to get involved. We're going to talk about why and what his name is and how significant his name is in a minute. But look how interesting this is. Source 12. When Ruth wants to meet this man, and Ruth and Boaz are discussing about whether he's going to marry her or not, they're discussing the concept of, source 12, lahakim shem hames, to perpetuate the name of the deceased being, in this case, Machlon. Ruth goes to Boaz and says to him, you are a potential redeemer. But he says, no, there is someone closer. Okay, so look at source 13. This is where the someone closer. We'll talk about Boaz a little bit later. Let's first talk about the other potential redeemer. So after Ruth has her evening with Boaz on the threshing floor, the following day, this is in Perek Dalad, V'hinei hagoel over asher diber Boaz. And the redeemer, potential redeemer, who Boaz spoke about, was passing by, coincidentally. Nothing's coincidentally. Vayomer, and Boaz said, Suru shovar po Ploni Almoni, Vayosa Vayeshev. And he called, Boaz called, and he said, now I've translated it as so-and-so. I'll explain to you why in a minute, but literally, his actual name recorded in the Book of Ruth is Ploni Almoni. We'll talk about his name in a minute. And he came over and he sat down. The Medrash tells us this man's name was actually Tov. The question is, why is he recorded in the Book of Ruth as Ploni Almoni? Shlomo HaLevi Alkabet said his name is hidden to avoid embarrassment, because he should have stood up and married Ruth and honored his obligations. He did not. He did not discharge his duty as a redeemer. Why did he not do that? Because he was not keen to marry Ruth. Why was he not keen to marry Ruth? I alluded to this at the beginning of the class today. Source 14. In Devarim, Perek Kaf Gimel, we are told explicitly in the Torah, Lo yovo Ammoni uMoavi bikal Hashem. An Ammonite and a Moabite are not allowed, they're allowed to convert, they're not allowed to marry anyone in the congregation of Hashem. Today, we don't know who's from Ammon and Moab, so we can't practically enforce this. But the reason is The Torah tells us in the following pasuk, Al devar asher lo kidmu eschem ba'lechem u'ba'mayim, because they didn't greet you with bread and water. So you'd think, surely Boaz was wrong. He shouldn't have married Ruth, and Ploni Almoni was right. But the Gemara in Yevamos tells us quite clearly, source 15 on the sheet, Amoni velo Amonis, Moavi velo Moavis. This applies to an Ammonite male and not an Ammonite female, a Moabite male and not a female Moabite. At the time, there was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and people had forgotten about this because a lot of people were not marrying Moabites. But at that time, Boaz was one of the judges, and they knew this law existed, and he was not worried in the slightest bit. Obviously, the Gemara was an oral tradition passed down from father to son, teacher to student, but not everything was remembered. So it was before the time that certainly no printing was happening there. Chazal darshan this because they say, because it was that they didn't greet you with bread and water. Remember I said right at the beginning, we talk about Moab. Moab is inhospitable. They don't give you bread and water. And that's the thing. Elimelech leaves Beis Lechem, a place which is called the house of bread, and he goes to a place, people renowned for not giving you in the desert bread and water. And Chazal tell us they didn't even sell it to them. Forget about giving it to them free. We're not asking for free. If you can't pass our land, you can't have anything. And Chazal darshan that it's because it was the men's responsibility to greet the soldiers or the enemy passing through the land, that is why women were not part of this prohibition. So we know now because we can see the Gemara, but at the time when it's an oral tradition, people forgot things. Can I ask whoever's writing on the screen not to do that, if that's okay? Jastro is an Aramaic translation of words in Tanakh, and he says, we're focusing now on the word Ploni Almoni. He says Almon, source 16. Almoni means unnamed, which is what I alluded to before. He becomes unnamed, unknown, disappear. We don't know what his name is. He's hidden. There's an opinion which says Almon, which means a widow, that he was Almoni. He was fit for a widow. He could have been the right person to marry the widow Ruth. Rashi in Megillas Rus says, source 17 on your sheet, let me scroll it up for you. Almoni, Almon, bli shame, mibli shame, someone who has no name, widowed without a name. Second opinion from Rashi, Sforim Archerim, Almoni, shehaya Almon midivrei Torah. He was widowed, i.e. disconnected from the words of the Torah. Shehaya lo lidrosh, he should have understood and expounded Amoni velo Amonis, what we spoke about in source 16. He didn't know that. He wasn't willing to accept the words of Chazal at that time. Moavi velo Moavis. Behu Omar, and this is a pasuk in Ruth a little bit later on in Perek Daled, Pen ashchis es nachalosi. He was worried people would think that he had acted inappropriately and gone against the words of the Torah, and therefore he did not fulfill his obligation to marry Ruth, which Boaz stepped in and did. Ploni Almoni, we would translate it perhaps in America like John Doe, like unidentified if someone found, anonymous. But in English, it's a very interesting translation, the one that I used, that I found, which is so-and-so, because you say like he's a right so-and-so, but so-and-so is also like Mr. Anonymous. Any questions? Comments? Okay, so let's look at Boaz, okay? Also a central character. This is source 18. Olonomi moda leisha ish gibor chayil mimishpachas Elimelech ushmo Boaz. This is where we introduced to Boaz at the beginning of Perek Beis, and his name was Boaz. According to the Gemara in Baba Basra, he was actually Ibsan, who was the 10th judge, and we learn about him in Sefer Shoftim, Perek Yud Beis. So why is he called Boaz in Megillas Rus? And for that, we're going to see something that Safas Emes says in source 19. HaPerush Boaz, look at the word Boaz, Boaz, like we say, Hashem Oz la'amo yotein, Bo in him, Oz is the strength. V'hayinu shehayu ma'amin b'divrei chachamim, shedarshu amoni v'lo amonis, v'lo haya sofet badova. The Safas Emes says he was strong. He didn't mind standing up for what he believed in. Chazal said, and the Rabbonim, the Chazal and the Sanhedrin at the time, which he was part of, said, yes, you are allowed to marry a female Ammonite. He stood up. He was strong enough to say, I am willing to marry her myself to show everybody that I agree and it's absolutely okay for someone to marry a Moabite female. There is another opinion. The Tikkunei Zohar says that he was strong in that he mastered his evil inclination. When Ruth sort of came up to him in the middle of the night, he was strong and he withheld that temptation. Ruth and Boaz have a son, and his name is Oved. And the Igeret Shmuel says that when they named, well, we see it does not quite, they don't name him, but because Boaz had already passed away straight after they got married and Ruth had conceived, their hope was that he would serve Hashem, be an Eved Hashem. Oved is like Eved Hashem with a full heart, and he perfected himself. So that's what I'd like to finish about Megillas Rus. And now, with the remaining time we've got left, I'd like to look at names in general in Tanakh and their significance in the words of our Chazal. First of all, this is my favorite quote. In Shmuel Aleph, we have a character whose name is Novel. Novel means either base, like low life, or carcass, corpse, revulsion, you can call him whatever you like. He was the first husband of Abigail, who became the wife of David, one of the wives of David HaMelech. Source 21. When we introduce to him, it says, Ki shemo Kainhu, for he is as his name says, which is like, his name is disgusting and his trait is disgusting. Novel shemo unovla imo. He was a revolting person. It's like Mr. Revolting is revolting. In English, you might say something like, novel by name, novel by nature. He was a revolting person. The Baal Shem Tov says, the word shame is the middle two letters of the word neshama. Neshama, our soul. Because your name is part of your soul, it represents a window into a person's soul. The Ramah writes that many people have a custom to adding a name to someone who is unwell, because changing a name changes a person's tafkid, because a person's soul is hinted to and connected to their name. Shame is very similar to the same letters as shom, because shom, there, your name is somehow projecting to the future. Your name is your purpose. The Shem Shmuel, source 23, says in one of his drashas, Ki Shem shel Adam moreh al mahuso. A person's name indicates his or her essence. He says that when he talks about Yosef. Yosef in the Torah is given two names, but the word Yosef is lahosif, to add, to continue, to improve. Yosef was the antidote to Esau, who was al-ayin sin vov, asui, someone who considered himself to be ready-made. He sort of thought, I do not need any improvement. I am amazing how I am. And that is not an attitude that the Jewish people should have. We should be more like Yosef. We should try, move ourselves forward, continually hoping for spiritual growth, and not think to ourselves that we are the ready-made product. I found this very interesting source. And for those people, some people have got a minhag when they finish Shemona Esrei, just before they say, they take 3 steps back to say a pasuk. So my name's Chava, so it starts with a ches and ends in a hey. So my pasuk is Chogra ba'oz masner v'tametz raseha. And people say that just before, just at the end of our midah. And where does this come from? It comes from a Rashi in the book of Micha, source 24. Kol misha omer b'chol yom mikra hamaschil u'mesayim k'mo shemaschil u'mesayim shemo haTorah matzilo megihinom. Anyone who says every day a pasuk from the Tanakh that starts and finishes with the same letters as their name, the Torah will save them from Gehenna. I'm not paskening, I'm just bringing this Rashi. Some people have got that minhag. There is an idea that everyone has to know what their name is. The idea behind that is you have to know what your name is, you have to know what your purpose is. What is your purpose? The final thing I'd like to discuss tonight is Hashem. Hashem, obviously that was a whole topic on its own, but Hashem, we say Hashem, he's got many names like Aleph, Daled, Nun, Vov, Yud K, Vov K, things like that, Shakai. But we call Hashem Ha-Shem, the name. In fact, we don't even really know today how to pronounce some of the names of Hashem because they are holy. Hashem's name is the name. It is holy. We say that the Kohen Gadol would say Hashem HaMefurash, the ineffable name of Hashem. We can't even say it. We don't even know what Hashem's name is. The Likutei Moharan, source 25, gives us a long piece, but he says, HaTorah hi Shemo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah, according to some opinions, the Torah itself is an expression of the name of Hashem, which is very difficult to understand. But somehow, perhaps through learning the Torah, we can begin to understand some of the unlimited essence of what Hashem is. Moshe himself, when he meets Hashem at the burning bush, he says, "What is your name?" And Hashem calls himself Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. As we approach Shavuos and Matan Torah, we learn that the Bnei Israel camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Vayichan Shom Yisrael neged Hahar. Israel camped opposite the mountain. Rashi famously asks, why is it in the singular? And he famously answers, source 27, Ke'ish echad belev echad. The word Vayichan, it should say Vayachanu Shom Yisrael neged Hahar. Israel camped in the plural. The whole of Israel camped. But Rashi says it's written in the singular because Ke'ish echad belev echad. Bnei Israel at that time were one man with one heart. Surely there is nothing more that Hashem wants to see than Am Yisrael as truly united as we were at the time of Matan Torah. We are on the cusp next week of Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and we are about to enter Shavuos. Every day we should be no saying HaTorah. Every day we should renew our faith and covenant in Hashem, a covenant with Hashem, and be as excited and fresh to receive the Torah. Ruth was the great-grandmother of David. David, we know, will be the ancestor of Mashiach, because we know Mashiach will be Mashiach ben David. Pasuk in Zechariah says, Vayom, source 28, Vayom hahu, on that day, talking about messianic times, Yeh Hashem echad, Hashem will be one, Hashem will be unified, Ushemo echad, and his name will be one. Perhaps I'd like to suggest, linking source 27 and 28, when Hashem sees Bnei Israel as Ish echad, Belev echad, it will be a time, and I'm hoping that it's going to be still before this Shavuos, and that the difficulties that a lot of people are facing at the moment will all go when Bnei Israel are united through Mashiach's arrival. He should come speedily in our days. B'mheira b'yameinu.
Thank you very much, Chava. Thank you.
Any questions?